Good and our panelists. I thank you for joining in today's program about engaging in successful, complex, challenging, and difficult conversations. My name is Wally Johnston. I'm co-founder and CFO of Energy for the Common Good, a nonprofit where we educate and advocate for clearing the pathway to advance fusion energy as rapidly as possible once it's available, a viable source of electricity and industrial power. You're going to hear from 5 people who have dedicated their careers to the advancement of clean energy technologies, many from the infancy of the movement to clean, safe energy supplies that reduce the reliance on climate change inducing fossil fuels. Each of them regularly encounter challenging situations in one-on-one, small group, and large event venues. The space we operate in is full of societal, political, and financial high-stakes issues requiring skill and deftness in discussions if we're to successfully advance agendas focused on clean energy advancement in time to make a difference to climate change mitigation. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker. Dr. Stephanie Diem is an assistant professor in the engineering physics department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where her experimental plasma physics research focuses on using microwaves to heat and drive current in magnetically confined high temperature plasmas for fusion energy development. Prior to this, she was staff scientist in the Fusion Energy Division at Oak Ridge National Lab, where she was on long-term assignment to the D3D National Fusion Facility in San Diego, California. Dr. Diem has been trained in science communication at the Alan Alda Science Communication Bootcamp at Stony Brook University. She currently serves on the APS Division of Plasma Physics Executive Committee, the APS DPP Committee for Women in Plasma Physics, and is co-leader of the U.S. Fusion Outreach Team, a grassroots organization focused on reducing barriers to outreach efforts. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hi, thank you, Wally, and thanks everyone for being here today. This is a really important topic, so I'm glad you could all join us. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about where I'm coming from and also kind of the approaches I use when I'm engaging with the public, especially when it comes to controversial topics. So my background, I actually picked science because a couple of reasons. I didn't like writing papers and I didn't enjoy politics. So spoiler alert, a lot of my time is spent writing and, distilling what we do as scientists to the public, to, staffers in DC, because I'm funded by taxpayer dollars through the Department of Energy. So when I was going through my education, because I picked those majors with those intentions, I really minimized any courses at all outside of math and science. I find in particular all the very intricate and minute details of math and science beautiful, and I really got into it. And higher education just focused me even more on those subjects. This backfired, as I mentioned, because a lot of my time is writing grants, writing papers, talking to people about our research, and distilling, we're funded by taxpayer dollars. We should be informing the public about what we do with their money and seeing what they, the public, find important about research or what concerns they have about the research that we're doing. And I find when I engage with people and really understand where they're coming from and what they find important or concerning, it can spark, new ideas and how I can, do research. And a lot of this comes from discussing these controversial topics, because that allows us to hear different perspectives of what people are thinking. With my hyper focus on math and science, when I was employed, I found that I kept, after school, scientist, I found I kept being thrown into engaging with the public. I was terrible at it because I just wasn't relating to the public. I confused people. They would glaze over because I talk at high level about science, and really the conversation wasn't two-way. So that's when I found Alan Alda's Science Communication Bootcamp at Stony Brook University. And that, if you're not familiar with, it teaches improv to scientists to help you focus on connecting with your audience, paying attention to the verbal, nonverbal cues so you can really tell if people are following you. It's focused on that concept of yes and really at the heart of that, yes, someone says something to you, you say yes, you acknowledge that you hear it, and when you use and, you're continuing the conversation and you're making this a two-way conversation. So some tips that I use, really look at the subject through the eyes of whoever you're having this conversation with. What would interest them, or you can relate to something that they have experienced. And this is using empathy. You can use empathy to connect you with whoever you're having a conversation with. And this is looking at really listening to them. What do they value? Who or what sources do they trust? So we're having this common ground when we're talking about to start from these controversial topics. We all have something in common, find it. And also, people love a struggle or a turning point. And science is really about learning something new. And rarely do experiments go exactly how we predict. And I think telling people about this struggle and learning something new, that really, really helps them understand the scientific process. And also acknowledging we're all human too. And getting back to that power of yes and, you're acknowledging that you hear people and you're understanding where they're coming from when you're using this empathetic form of communication. And that really continues the conversation and you learning from each other too. And then I also wanted to emphasize building a connection and finding something to relate to. So there's a variety of different ways that we engage with people, having one-on-one discussions, or informally or formal. So a lot of my talks to the public are about fusion, clean energy solutions that are needed to address climate change. So right away, I'm jumping in to talk about potentially a subject like climate change that people think may be controversial from the start. So that's why, especially in virtually, I start all of my talks with a slide about who I am outside of science. So I have pictures of my family, my hobbies, things like that, my nieces doing crafts, running around dogs. And this helps people straight from the start find some common ground and leads to many more people engaging after talks. And so they're listening from the start because we've found this common ground. And then I know I'm just a couple more minutes or just a few seconds. Make sure to, when you're distilling your message, use language to make it easier for people to follow your meaning. And it keeps them interested and engaged, and use analogies. And so briefly, the framework that I start when I do these conversations is step one, define the goal of the interaction. What do you hope the outcome of the engagement will be? What do you want them to know, think, feel, or do? Step two, I kind of call this a discovery. What do we know about the audience? Do people ask questions, show empathy, active listening, be honest and genuinely curious about people, and establish that connection. What do you have in common? And then pick your approach. And that's kind of what we talked, the abstract has a variety of different approaches too, to engage the audience. And so, yeah, I'll just kind of wrap it up with really understanding who you're talking to and connecting with them really helps to engage in these controversial topics. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Our next speaker is Laban Koblenz. He's head of communications at ITER, the world's largest multinational science and technology project, a collaboration of 35 countries to demonstrate industrial scale fusion energy. He's worked at the NRC, in the US Congress, on the staff of Senator Joe Lieberman, and at the International Atomic Energy Agency, where he advised Director General El Baradi on nuclear diplomacy in Iraq, Iran, and other political hotspots. So he's no stranger to complex, difficult conversations. Laban, welcome.
Thank you, Wally. And Steffi, thank you for stealing all my talking points. I could just wrap it up and go on to the next speaker now. But I want to endorse what Stephanie said. I think what I'll try to do to complement that is to give you, as Wally suggested, a little sort of a personal angle on this. I've had the strange misfortune of a career based on poor planning. I grew up in, Wally didn't mention this, but I'm American, but I grew up Amish Mennonite. So I grew up in a culture that was averse to, supposedly full of love. They weren't all that great with outsiders, but they were averse to technology and higher education. And somehow I ended up here at Eacher and in a career that largely focuses um, on communication and advanced science and technology and entrepreneurship. So coming from Amish, Wally gave you the background. I rode submarines. Yeah, I served in the US Senate. I was a nuclear inspector for safety in the US, and then part of the weapons inspections with the IAEA in these controversial hotspots, and then university sector, then private sector startups. And all I can tell you is I feel like the most fortunate guy in the world because it is that richness, it is that um, endless curiosity to understand not the people who are like you. Yes, that's fun for having a beer after work. It's fun when all of your family members get together and you feel that feeling of comfort. But the discovery that comes with taking somebody who looks like they must be at the opposite end of your spectrum and finding something unique with them. There are few pleasures for me that are more important than that. So yeah, I have ridden Harley Davidsons with rough-edged conservatives. I have written a ton of speeches as a Black woman, from that perspective, because I was writing for someone else whom I admired very, very much. I've sat, as Wally said, I've sat across the table from Iranians, and I have looked at the degree to which, or Iraqis, the degree to which cultural divides shaped enormous differences between the, say, European and American and other inspectors who were there, and the Iranians who were trying desperately to convince them that they were not developing nuclear weapons. And I think that coming out of those experiences has shaped how I view my own beloved country these days. I don't think in the US, there are many, many important topics that we're dealing with. You could list your own slate if you were running for president or running for national office, or bringing your slate of what you would bring to the Supreme Court. I mean, we're talking, energy for the common good is very much focused on energy topics. One could easily say there's no more important topic for the future of our planet than that. And in fact, there's a later speaker you're going to meet, Greg, who works at a think tank. I won't steal his thunder, but he asked me a while back to write an essay, and I still haven't finished it because the topic of the essay was, what is the future? And I'm like, are you serious? And he said, yeah, do that in 1 or 1.5 pages. And how do you do that? And I've gotten as far as the first paragraph now. I boiled it down to a different title, which is The Future We Create, emphasizing the importance of choice. And I think the future will come down to 3 choices: how we treat science and technology, how we choose, I should say, to treat science and technology, how we choose to treat our planet, but also how we choose to treat the other, the person or group that is different than us. And of course, we focus on differences in global inequality. We focus on differences of economics, differences of geography, differences of ethnicity, of gender. All of those things are amazingly important. But we will lose democracy in our country if we stop valuing the diversity of intellect, diversity of viewpoint. Something has been happening for the last probably decade. I really came across it in the last 5 years or so, which is you all hear about it as the echo chamber, the reinforcement of always getting the same news from the same sources. And so I just started reading everything about, this was when, back when Trump was in the primaries, and I was terrified for various reasons, but I started reading everything from the Huffington Post and my beloved New York Times and CNN, and where I thought I was getting impartial news, all the way to Breitbart and alt-right news sites. And what I found, just to add to what Stephanie has said, is that often when we are in the middle of a conversation where we think the person on the other side should just go jump out a window, like, how can you even think that? How can you be possibly so, and you want to say things like uneducated, stupid, insane, all of these, you want to say those things. Very often, what we fail to understand is that they're reading an entirely different news diet. they're getting different sources. And yes, you can label everything that the opposing party is using as fake news, but it doesn't really help. So how do you get, Stephanie talked about a lot of the formulas, so I won't go over that. I would just add two things. One, always figure out whether you are trying to inform somebody and what are your best elements for informing, approaches for informing. Convince is really hard. And a lot of this will sound like a lot of this conversation today will sound like it's about convincing. It is not always convincing. And also inspiring. And remember that if you're giving a speech, but also probably if you're sitting at the Thanksgiving dinner table with your horrible uncle that always takes controversial positions, the thing that people will remember about you most is going to be, is there a connection? Do I like you? And lastly, I would emphasize storytelling, and we'll talk about that more later.
Thank you, Levin. And I had a conversation with Greg just the other day, and it made me think especially when we're in a forum like this, it's important to think about geography because, right now we're talking to people from around the globe and we're all in different situations. I think I described it as, I don't know what we call what we're trying to do here in the United States. And Greg's lives in a country with a social democracy and the other types of government we have. And we're talking about global issues that have to be implemented on a local scale. And it's important to be thinking about who your audience is when you're having these conversations. And with that, I'll introduce Greg. Greg de Timmeren is a leading material scientist and plasma physicist who has worked on nuclear fusion since the start of his PhD in 2003. He specializes in the study of the intense interactions between fusion plasmas and surrounding materials, a topic of intense interest for the commercialization of fusion energy. Mr. de Timmeren has published over 240 articles in peer-reviewed journals. In December 2020, he became the managing director of Xenon Research, where he's turning his deep scientific knowledge toward developing better understanding of key factors and changes to our long-term future, with particular focus on the energy transition, the links between energy, human development, and the economy. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I'm French, so you will have to bear with my lovely French accent for the next few minutes. I'm sorry about that. Some people find that very sexy, some not. And since the previous two speakers actually said a lot, I will start by another angle, which is one of the reasons why I actually left academia last year. Two things happened in the world or in France at least last year, COVID-19 like everywhere else, but mainly there was a huge negative reaction to vaccines, to sanitary measures in France. There was a lot of rise of different theories, alternative theories about where the virus came from, whether we needed to be vaccinated, the fact that Bill Gates was a big evil actually trying to vaccinate us all and putting sensors in us and so on. And the reason I think it's important is because it marked in France at least a big split between society and science. People do not understand science anymore and have very huge difficulties in understanding what is going on in science and why things might be changing fast. The second thing, which is much more positive, which happened in France 2 years ago, is as part of a plan to fight against climate change. The government decided to create what we call a Citizenship Convention. So 150 people were chosen randomly and they were asked to spend 10 weekends together trying to think about climate change. They were educated on it. They were given all the information and access to all the experts they could. And they were asked to propose 150 solutions or proposals to actually reduce France's emissions by 40% compared to 1990. And what this showed is actually most of those people actually didn't know about climate change. Some of them were actually thinking this was not existing or was not caused by humans. And after that, they all actually acknowledged that climate change was real, was caused by humans. And they actually made very, very intelligent proposals to the governments. Fortunately, not all of them were passed by law, but that's already an interesting exercise. The reason I'm mentioning that And the reason what I'm trying to do now is trying to put science back into the discussion. It's very interesting that people don't understand anymore how knowledge is actually made. How do we actually get to know things that we know? How do we actually realize that things might have some doubts? How can we actually communicate probabilities, doubts, and those kind of things to the public? I think that's very important because a lot of people now talk in terms of dogma. Science is right, which is probably the worst thing you can actually say. And there is also a lack of expertise, or at least the people you see in the media, and mainly in France, but I guess it's the same elsewhere, are people who talk a lot, but not necessarily about things they know, but about things they think they know. And the difference between somebody like that and a scientist is a scientist can tell you what he knows, but mainly what he doesn't know. And that's very disturbing for people, because if you say, I don't know, most likely you're not going to be invited again to another panel discussion or anything like that, because people prefer people having answers. And I think this is extremely important because, again, there is a big gap between what we know, what knowledge we have actually gained, and what people actually now understand of it. And the best thing probably you can do is explain to people and explain things as simple as possible. I mean, there is no science you cannot explain with simple words. Even quantum physics you can do. There is a fantastic series about quantum physics for babies, for example, which is extremely well made. And I think what is very important is to make sure people understand how we came to those conclusions. How do we know that climate change is actually caused by humans? How do we know that energy is so important for our society and so on? If people can at least acknowledge those facts and how we get to those conclusions, then that's already a first step into the discussion. And then the last thing I'll say is, as a scientist, I tend to think that if I follow a scientific method, it's fine. I will come to the right conclusions, or at least I will come somewhere. But it's important to acknowledge biases. Where do people get their information from? How do you actually get your information from? Because depending, I mean, algorithms are very good at making sure that you always read the same kind of information or the same sources. And this is something we can very easily forget about. And then if you meet somebody who comes from another bubble in a way, well, then you just keep hearing different information, and it's very hard to recognize why people might have different opinions, although you think the science is right or the facts are correct. So I think understanding all the kind of cognitive biases that we can have is also very important into the discussion. And there are tricks you can use to try and detect them, try to detect how people actually get to think that they think of something in particular. And once you already realize that, you have a first starting point where you can try to use that in another way and divert the conversation. That's basically what I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. Our next presenter is V. John White. He's the Executive Director of the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technologies, known as CERT, which he co-founded in 1990. CERT is a nonprofit coalition of the nation's leading public interest environmental groups and businesses working on energy efficiency and renewable technologies. Mr. White has led collaborative efforts between renewable energy companies and conservation groups to ensure timely approval of more than 10,000 megawatts of new solar and wind projects while protecting critical habitat and establishing innovative mitigation measures. During his career, he's been involved in the creation and passage of several landmark pieces of environmental legislation, including the California Clean Air Act and the Pavley Clean Car Bill, and the development of alternative fuels and the adoption of the zero emissions vehicle mandate. John, take it away.
Thank you, Wally, and thank you to Energy for Common Good for inviting me. I have lived my career at the intersection between science and politics and communities. And I'm sadly not a scientist, but I've learned to work with them and to understand the importance of including the most current and relevant research and applied science to public policy. And over the course of my career, I've seen, we originally started working on energy because of the impact on air pollution. This was in the 70s, before the threat of climate change was fully upon us. And we were looking at power plants and oil refineries and vehicles for the impact they had on smog. And in the old days, California used to use fuel oil a lot of the time in our power plants because there wasn't natural gas available. And we have always imported large amounts of coal from the Southwest. So we have made a very significant beginning in our transition. We also made a decision in the 70s not to expand nuclear power. There was a huge amount of pressure at the time to build a fleet of fission plants on the coast. At the time, the load growth of demand was around 8% a year. And so the first thing that we did from a policy standpoint is to focus on efficiency and appliance efficiency standards and so forth. And so that load growth got flattened a bit, and we began to develop a portfolio of alternative technologies. Ironically, we're now in a place where the green resources, solar, wind, storage, are actually getting to be close to less expensive than fossil fuels. And we find ourselves trying to evolve from being pleased by renewables because they're green and clean and important for global warming, to now we need to buy them to save money and to increase reliability. Now, this has resulted in a lot of debate and argument. As was Wally mentioned, we did a fair amount of troubleshooting and mediating between the conservation community and renewable developers in the last 10 years. A lot of environmentalists are for renewables in theory, but when it comes to the specific projects, particularly large scale solar and wind projects, there's often opposition. And what you hear from some of the environmentalists is, well, we just do rooftop solar and that's sufficient. Everything else, we don't want transmission. We don't want utility scale renewables in the desert. We want rooftop solar, and rooftop solar is great. But what we discovered when you actually look at the physics of the grid is that you need a balanced portfolio. You need to understand the importance of transmission. And in fact, you need to understand the importance of physics. I think one of the things that is lost on many people is the extent to which electricity is bound by certain fundamental laws, and certain principles, and they can't be discarded. There was one legislator who was famous for his efforts to transform and deregulate the California grid, and one of the utility executives said to him, "Senator, you can't ignore the laws of physics in thinking about how to run the electric system." And he said, "Just watch me." And this then led to a debacle where we commoditized reliability and created a deregulated environment that allowed us to be victimized by some Enron trading and other practices. So I think there's a lot of humility that needs to be brought to this space. I also think that some of the comments made earlier about the importance of storytelling, the importance of personalizing and understanding where the audience is, what their experience is. For example, I think one of the issues that has to be addressed with fusion is the difference between fusion and fission. I don't want to characterize myself as anti-nuclear per se, but it is the case that California has walked away from fission. We are just announced the replacement of Diablo Canyon nuclear plant, which is the last nuclear plant in the state, with a portfolio of zero carbon resources, including wind, solar, geothermal, and storage. But the thing we have to, I think, grasp, even though we are confident of the role that renewables can play, is that the goal of protecting the planet from global warming is going to require a substantial amount of electrification. And we haven't thought about that as much, which means we electrify vehicles, we electrify buildings, we electrify industry. We're going to need a much larger grid. And one of the things we've learned from our experience is that not everybody has the same mix of renewable resources. California is uniquely blessed. If we didn't do renewables, people would question whether we knew what we were doing, because we have an abundance. But not every part of the country, not every part of the world has that same portfolio available to it. And I think fusion's opportunity is to play a role in that large-scale electrification, where we have a base of clean, renewable, and efficient resources, but we need to augment that portfolio with zero carbon resources that can be built on a large scale. So I'll leave the physics of fusion to y'all, but I think the importance when talking to skeptical audiences is understanding what purpose is to be served by the utilization of these technologies, what public purpose, what problems can be solved, as a way to have people understand why we want them to focus on this particular set of solutions. It's because of what the work that they can do for society and the ability that they have to help us accomplish our goals.
Thank you, John. I think that highlights the importance of what we're talking about here, that folks with the scientific capacity of people on the call here are able to talk to those of us who may not be quite as adept at the sciences, but just as involved in the importance of moving these critical facets of energy forward. Our next speaker is Jane Hotchkiss. She's the co-founder and my partner as president of Energy for the Common Good, a nonprofit organization seeking to advance the acceptance of fusion energy as an integral part of the clean energy economy. She spent the early part of her energy career in California working with former regulatory staff and renewable CEOs focused on building markets for the renewable industry, followed by becoming the first renewables advocate at both the Conservation Law Foundation and the Land and Water Fund of the Rockies. Ms. Hotchkiss has challenged the fossil fuel industry directly as a co-founder of the Clean Air Task Force, developing a national field of coal campaigns, and as a lead clean air and climate consultant to PG&E on its Madison Wind Project and its national energy team. As a leader of ECG, she now dedicates her expertise to fusion's social licensing process, preparing the external world to believe, invest, license, and regulate fusion for the promise it holds at the steady state, as the steady state, safe, zero carbon energy supply necessary to balance renewable grids and hasten the end of our reliance on fossil fuels. Welcome, Jane.
Did I, whoops. Okay, can people hear me? Good, all right. Hang on, yep. All right, sorry, we're double teaming in our space because we are, ironically, our connection, our broadband grid went down in our main office. So we've consolidated at a house, and many computers speaking at once sometimes have an echo chamber. So which is why Wally's computer, his visual is lit and I'm speaking. I guess that what I would just simply say in the, given our time and the fact that I know that one of our leaders, John, has to leave on the earlier side, I want to just summarize and say, yes, in terms of what Stephanie said, yes to everything Laban said, yes to Greg. And I started my career at a large law firm in San Francisco and met John White early in my life. So he's one of my mentors. So clearly, yes to many of the things that just came out of John's mouth. although I'm shocked to have heard all of them, because it is the renewable community that's going to be one of the challenges that we face in terms of, as was said, convincing the community there's a difference, and a worthy difference, between fusion and fission, and that fusion is a friend, not a foe. And by way of background for myself, what isn't said is, in some respects, because I'm always the odd duck, I'm probably the right speaker in most difficult conversations. One, because I hate them. And oddly, that's where I find myself always. I have this incredible ability to be perhaps ahead of the game in a lot of places, and sharing things which are very obvious to me and shocked that they're not obvious to other people, because I'm not a physicist and I'm not a lawyer. The list of the things I'm not is long, and yet I find myself often in front of audiences instead of hiding in the back, which is where I think I'd much rather be. And just by way of quick synopsis, in fact, perhaps one of the worst things I ever imagined doing was holding an elected political office. And I just finished 6 years as a select board member of Concord, Massachusetts, which is, while a small town, it is a scary percentage of incredibly high achieving academic, scientific, and corporate leaders of all sectors, from utility CEOs to chairmen of departments. And I had to endure their comments about my performance weekly. So, clearly I'm a glutton for punishment. Hopefully my punishments have resulted in some skill building, and that I'll be able to share that with the folks who join me in my breakout session and beyond this seminar, this webinar, in the work that ECG does to expand fusion space. As Wally said, our goal is to prepare the world to be excited about fusion. And we look at fusion backwards from the commercial perspective, because for fusion to be, to take its role in achieving its environmental and climate and societal benefits, it has to leave the tradition of science. It has to leave DOE. It has to leave ITER, and it has to become, in some cases, a boiler, in some cases, the energy supply for X. And that's going to be difficult, because for those who are most active in this technology now, it's still the greatest accomplishment out there, versus a supply of heat or a supply of power. So with that, I am excited to join our breakout sessions.
Jane. So I'd like to thank you to our panelists, and look forward to the breakout sessions. I'm going to turn it over to Claudia, who's going to describe the next part of our webinar here. Claudia.
Hi, everyone. So just a quick thing, so go to the QR code here if you haven't gone that yet. You can also, well, whenever my internet decides to work, I'll put the link on the chat, so we're going to go into breakout rooms now to have open discussions about these topics. So we will stop the recording now, and then we will send you